Our reading this evening is taken from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13, which is in page 1012 of the Church Bible. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected. But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." Amen.
I wonder if you've ever had a moment. You're sitting down and you're watching a film, you're 30 or 40 minutes in, and you start to get this feeling. And you begin to wonder to yourself, the person you're watching, are they actually the hero of the film? Think about the Karate Kid. Daniel moves to a new town, gets bullied, and then this old guy shows up, Mr. Miyagi. And this is the guy who's supposed to help him. He will be the mentor, the sensei, the one who's going to teach him to fight back. But if you know the film, you will know instead of doing karate, what's Mr. Miyagi got him doing? Waxing cars. Wax on, wax off. Painting fences, sanding floors. And you can imagine, there's Daniel, out there day after day, sweating in the sun, doing what feels like a pointless job. And somewhere along the way, you can imagine Daniel thinking to himself, is this really the guy? Is this really the way it's going to go? And I imagine that's something of how the disciples are feeling as we approach our passage this evening. For think about it, back in chapter 8, which seems like a long time ago that we were in now, Jesus told us that he was going to suffer and that he was going to die. So verse 31, Mark chapter 8, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then he goes on to tell his disciples, if they're going to follow him, if they're going to walk the path of the rabbi, they need to deny themselves, take up their crosses, and follow him too. Verse 34. If anyone wants to be my disciple, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now let's be clear, that's not what the disciples signed up for. They had visions of victory, of Jesus overthrowing Rome, of Jesus acting as the rightful king, the Messiah taking his place and bringing in power, security, and glory. But now here's Jesus, and he's talking of suffering. He's talking of death. You can almost picture Peter turning to John and saying, did we get the right guy? Is this really the way it's going to go? And Christian, maybe you felt something of that too. You started walking with Jesus and you thought your life would get easier. But life has been hard. Prayers feel like they go by unanswered. Struggles feel relentless. Pain feels pointless. Addictions never stay dead for long. Doubts creep in. And you begin to wonder, Did I miss something? Is this really the way? Is Jesus really the one? And here now, as we turn to our passage in Mark chapter 9, following on from that conversation back in chapter 8, you will see that Jesus takes up onto a mountain, verse 2, Peter, James, and John. And there on the mountain, we will see Jesus gives these men pictures and signs and symbols that show them, and in turn us today, that following after this one, this man, this king, is absolutely worth it. That even if you end up losing your life, it's not to miss out, but it is to win. And so tonight, as we look at verse 2 through to verse 13, there's three symbols or three pictures or signs that Jesus gives to these men to help them keep going, keep trusting, keep pressing on as they walk the path of their rabbi. And so firstly, we see the greater Sinai, glory revealed on a mountain. It's been 6 months now since we've been back in Mark's gospel. We paused at that textual break of the divinity of Jesus. But as we step back into this book now and continue our series in Mark, we need to reorientate ourselves. Because what happened back in chapter 8 shapes how we approach chapter 9. Because do you remember where Peter made that declaration of the divinity of Christ? He made it in Caesarea Philippi. And Caesarea Philippi was a place that screamed the might and the worth of the Roman Empire. And right there in the shadow of all of that earthly strength, Peter makes that spirit-filled declaration that it is not Caesar who sits on the ultimate throne, but Jesus, verse 29. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. You're the King. And in response, how does Jesus then refer to himself? He speaks of himself in verse 38 as the Son of Man. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels. Now, if you know your Old Testament well, like many of you do, and if you know the book of Daniel particularly, you will have alarm bells ringing at that moment. Because there in Daniel chapter 7, we get this stunning vision of the throne room of God. And one like the Son of Man approaches the throne. The context of Daniel 7 is the Son of Man is one who is given dominion. He's given glory. He's given an eternal kingdom. That there is a king coming, and that king is going to come in power. But what Jesus says and does in chapter 8 must have left the disciples reeling. Because he says the Son of Man is coming, but the Son of Man is going to suffer. He will, as Daniel foretold back in Daniel 7, come into his Father's house with his holy ones. But the path to glory, Jesus will say, runs straight through the cross. The crown will come, yes, but the way the crown comes is through the cross. And so you can imagine, since chapter 8, the disciples are reeling. Their heads are spinning over the last 6 days, asking themselves the question, if Jesus is the Son of Man, if he is the Messiah, verse 29, if he is this king, then how in the world is his kingdom going to come if death is on the horizon? And with that in mind, we come to our text, verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up onto a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. So there they are, Jesus and his inner 3 disciples, all alone on a mountain, and suddenly Jesus himself is radiant, resplendent, transfigured. It shows us that Jesus is just like his Father. He is holy as God is holy. He is light as God is light. And then as Mark continues to write, we see standing before Jesus in all of his glory appears on the mountain 2 titanic figures from the Old Testament of Moses and Elijah. Now they're not just 2 random prophets or people pulled out from the past. They're symbols, aren't they? They're symbols of the law and of the prophets. For if you know your Old Testament, you will know Moses was the great lawgiver. He led the people of God out of slavery in Egypt, and he brought them to the threshold of the promised land, and he gave them the law. And then there was Elijah, the prophet, who called down fire from heaven, who stood before a tidal wave of idolatry and called the people back to covenant faithfulness. They are symbols, signs of the law and the prophets. These are men who had led, who had guided, who had bled for the people of God. They had spoken truth. They were servants in God's house. But Moses and Elijah were men who never finished the job. They're part of redemptive story, but they don't complete redemption story. Moses, yes, was the human means of delivering the people, but deliverance wasn't the goal. It was deliverance to dwell. Moses had brought the people to the edge of the promised land, but he never got inside. Elijah was a man who had seen revival in his day. He had torn down altars and called the people back to God, but he had not seen the long-term renewal. The people still wandered. They were still waiting for the day where the covenant wouldn't be written on stone, but on hearts. They're symbols of the law and the prophets, but the story continued to go on. But now what do we have standing before those men is the one to whom all the stories point. One who is radiant, blazing and alive. One who could do what they could never do. Here is one who will complete the story. For here is one who will not just proclaim the law or bring the law. He is the Word made flesh. He's not just a servant in the house. He is the Son over the house. For here is the true prophet, priest, and king. And notice the divine declaration given about this one. Verse 7. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him. Do you see it? Moses and Elijah are here not to correct Jesus, but to yield to him. Because what they could only point to in signs and symbols, Jesus will fulfill in flesh and blood. This is a moment not just of a dazzling display of glory, but it's a moment of fulfillment. It is the Father saying everything that has been happening throughout history has been leading to this time, to this one. It is, as Mark has done throughout this book, he is crying out, look, something new is happening. And we've seen this as we've walked through Mark's Gospel through the first 8 chapters. Jesus is not merely an extension of what came before. He's not a patch on the old cloth or a name to be added to a list of prophets. He's so new he cannot be contained, as we saw in previous chapters, in the old wineskins. This is a new beginning. Here in chapter 9, the curtain is being pulled back as we get a dazzling display of the divinity of the Son. Remember in the book of Exodus, Moses had gone up onto the mountain. He had ascended into the cloud, and there God had given him the law. And there, as Moses catches a glimpse of the holiness of God, he comes down from the mountain and his face shines. And what do we here see upon this mountain? We do not see reflected glory, but we see the source of glory itself. For notice, Jesus does not come down from the mountain with his face glowing, because here is one who has been near glory. He radiates glory on the mountain because, friends, he is the glory. And so there in Mark chapter 9, while Moses on Sinai encountered the presence of God in a cloud, here Jesus ascends onto another mountain, and this time he is radiating glory. Because this is not just a prophet catching a glimpse. This is the Son unveiling himself and the Father declaring, here is the one. This is my Son. Listen to him. And brothers and sisters, when you think of this passage in its particular context, where back in chapter 8, the call to follow Christ was to be a call to walk the path that he's walking. And that would have easily left a sense of fear in the disciples. They could have easily wondered, is this really the one? Is this really the way? Here in this incredible moment, in this display of divine glory, a declaration is being made. The one they are following, the one they are called to follow, is but God himself, the one in whom the Father in heaven is fully pleased. And friends, when you think about it, we have those moments too, don't we? When the Christian life feels hard, when the cost seems high, and we, if we're honest, can begin to wonder, is this really worth it? And so we approach Mark chapter 9, and we see the Son revealed in his glory, affirmed by two titanic figures of the Old Testament, law and the prophets, and acknowledged by the Father. And Mark is crying out to the church today, yes, he is. And so firstly, glory revealed on a mountain. Secondly, the new tabernacle, God dwelling with sinners. I realized this afternoon after preaching this morning on Matthew 28 that it was in fact 5 years ago to the very Sunday that I preached here for the first time. And I preached on Matthew 28. And from that Sunday to this day, life has changed in many, many ways. What began as a process of me just coming to preach as the assistant pastor from down the road soon began to snowball. I knew it was changing when instead of the normal email from David, come along and preach whatever you want, there was a particular email. Could you come and preach on 1 Samuel 6? Now, 1 Samuel 6 is one of the strangest passages in the Old Testament. We're talking 5 golden tumors, golden rats, cows lowing down the road, the Ark of the Covenant, and 70 men are struck down dead. Thanks again, brothers, by the way. That's great. And as I began to read that passage and think about it, it struck me again what 1 Samuel 6 is all about is the holiness of God. It puts on display in HD in 4K the severity and the seriousness of not treating Yahweh the way Yahweh should be treated. And we saw that the other week, didn't we, in Leviticus 16. There is a deadly and a dangerous gap between the holiness of God and the sinfulness of man. So much so, the book of Leviticus tells us that something has to die. Blood has to be shed so that humanity can come near to the presence of God. But what do we have here? We have humanity, 3 men standing in the presence of God, in front of the transfigured Christ in all his radiant glory, but they're not struck down dead like the men in 1 Samuel 6. So what's happening? Well, it's not, friends, that the holiness of God has changed, but Mark is alluding to the fact that in Jesus, the way sinful people will stand in the presence of God is being rewritten because something new is happening. I've been on my best behavior for the last 6 months. But you need to forgive me. Lord of the Rings illustration. I've got 6 months to my review, so this will be forgotten by then, I'm sure. So in the Lord of the Rings, you know the films, they were shot in New Zealand. And some of the locations they went to were absolutely breathtaking, but very remote. So much so, sometimes they were having to helicopter crew up onto the mountainside, and they had to take with them survival gear. Because in the parts of the country they were in, if the weather turned and the cloud coverage came over, the helicopters could not rise to the heights where they were, and so there was a chance that they might have to stay overnight. So they took emergency shelters with them. Here in Mark chapter 9, we see Peter, who often is that one who speaks before he thinks, looks at this scene and he looks at Jesus and he says, verse 5, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now the word shelter there, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word they use is the word tabernacle. So it's as if Peter is saying, should we build 3 tabernacles? One for you, one for Moses the lawgiver, and one for the great prophet Elijah. Now, Peter is not saying that because, like in New Zealand, the cloud coverage might come and then I have to camp out. No, there is a sense that unknowingly here, Peter is reaching back to something. Remember the other week in Leviticus chapter 16, we began by thinking about how Exodus ended. And Exodus ended with the transcendent one, Yahweh himself, showing up. And there was a tabernacle, and there was a cloud. And what do we have here? We have God himself, we have a tabernacle, and we have a cloud. There in Exodus, or in Exodus 34, the cloud was a physical sign of the holy presence of God. But there's a difference between Exodus and Mark. In Exodus, when the presence of God shows up, humanity has to stay back. But what do we have here? We do not have distance, but we have presence. Jesus is there, and 3 ordinary men, his disciples, are brought right into the cloud, into the middle of the holiness and the glory of God, but they are not destroyed. And how is that so? Because Jesus is the new and better meeting place between man and God. That Jesus is going to make a way for sinful people to dwell forever in the presence of God, because he will come down from this mountain and he will fulfill what Moses and Elijah had only whispered at. For we see, thirdly, the true and better Exodus. You know that little phrase, I'd love to be a fly on the wall. We obviously say that when there's a conversation that's happening behind closed doors. Something interesting, something fascinating that we'd love to overhear. Here in our passage we have Jesus, we have Moses, and we have Elijah. And the text of verse 4 tells us they are talking with one another. And immediately, if you're like me, you think, I'd love to hear. I'd love to be a fly on the wall. Well, if you know Luke's gospel, you'll know Luke helps us fill in a gap. Because in Luke chapter 9, verse 31, of this moment he says this: they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Now, our passage is already dripping with Old Testament allusions. They're everywhere, but there's one here that's not immediately obvious. But I hope that you will see it. Because here, what do we have? Well, in many ways, we have a picture of Adam. So think back to Genesis 1 and 2. What do you have? You have Adam, the Son of God, on a mountain. Now, how do we know Eden was a mountain? Because we know water flowed from it. That's mountain language. And where was Adam? He's on the mountain, created by God on the 6th day. And what do you have here? You have the true Son of God, the second Adam, and he's on a mountain. And did you catch a reference to 6 days? But this passage is now not talking about the work of creation, but we are being told of something more significant in redemptive history. For as this mountain scene comes to a close, it hints to us of the work of the second Adam to undo what the first had done wrong. Because now it's not the work of creation, but it's the work of redemption. Because that word in Luke 9, departure, in the original Greek is translated as Exodus. Jesus is on the mountain talking with the prophets and the law, and he's talking about his Exodus. And so here is Jesus, the true and better Adam, revealing something of his great work, not to create the world, but to bring redemption to the world. For here is the Son now standing on the precipice of the greatest moment in redemptive history, discussing with these 2 figures from the Old Testament how he will accomplish the ultimate Exodus, how he will lead Israel out of Egypt, bringing sinners out of slavery to the bondage of sin, Satan, and death. Back in chapter 8, after Peter's Spirit-inspired declaration that Jesus is the Christ, Jesus then began to explain what was coming next. We've seen it already, of his suffering, of his rejection, of his death. And if you know the passage well, you will know that you have Peter, who we just seem to love because he's so like us. Peter hears this, he calls Jesus the Christ, and then what does he do? He pulls Jesus aside and starts rebuking Jesus. Because from Peter's perspective, this did not fit. Peter could not comprehend the means and the methods for how the kingdom will come. Will it surely come through suffering and death? That's not what victory looks like. And yet here in our passage, Jesus again teaches his disciples once more of his death and resurrection, because this is the way that the kingdom will come, and Peter and the rest of the disciples must see it. Verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. So perhaps the disciples thought Jesus is speaking in metaphor. Perhaps he's speaking symbolically. But despite all of the confusion, Jesus doesn't shy away, because in verse 12, he draws them once more back to his death. Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restore all things. Why then it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected?" It's as if Jesus is saying to his disciples, "You've seen my glory. You've seen the truth of who I am, but now here, the path that I am on and the path that you are called to follow is the path of the cross." Because Jesus is telling his disciples then and today, his death is not a side note to the mission, it is the mission itself. It is the plan. It is the Exodus moment of Jesus. Here is the second Adam undoing what the first Adam fell into on his mountain. For just like Moses, here is one who will now lead God's people out of slavery, but not to Egypt, but slavery to sin and death. And in his life, he will do what Elijah could not do. He will turn the people's hearts back to God, and they will stay with God forever, because the law will not be written on stone, but in the hearts of his people. And what will be the result of Jesus fulfilling this mission, of finishing the story that was never fully realized in the prophets and the law? Well, we've seen a glimpse of it already. Because there is coming a day, because of Jesus, because of this greater exodus, when sinful people can and will dwell in the holy presence of God. Not on a mountain for a moment, but forever and a day. And how will that be possible? Because Jesus will descend from this mountain in Mark 9, and he will climb another mountain in Mark's Gospel. Jesus himself, through his death and resurrection, will make the way. He will be the means by which humanity can dwell eternally near God. And that is why Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected. Because there is no path to glory without Jesus walking the path that leads him through the cross. And because of the work of the second Adam, what these men experienced on a mountain for a fleeting moment will be, Christian, your ultimate and your forever moment. You will stand in the presence of God, wrapped in his brilliance and glory, but unlike the terror of Sinai, unlike the severity of the 70 in 1 Samuel who were struck down dead, you will not now die. You will live in the truest sense of the word, not because you aren't sinful, but because you have been clothed in a new man. And brothers and sisters, knowing that, it shapes everything. It fuels how we live. It helps us to do all that Jesus has called us to back in chapter 8, because when we see Jesus for who he is as the Son that we must listen, verse 7 of our passage, then denying ourselves, dying to self, and taking up our cross and following him, that is not to be a burden, but joy. Because you know who you're following, and you know what is coming. Friends, in the wider church, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about the prosperity gospel. Promises of eternal wealth, abundance, health, and healing. And I want to tell you this evening, the prosperity gospel is 100% true. 100% true. And before you fire me, let me go on. The thing they have got wrong is the timeline. For there is hope, there is health, And there is healing. But those things are found this side of heaven, not that side. Joel Osteen, one of the prominent voices in the prosperity gospel, released a book a number of years ago called Your Best Life Now. And from a Christian perspective, let's just say if it's your best life now, then that means your future life is not with God. Because the Bible tells us this life is not as good as it gets. In fact, it's the other way around. The Bible tells us in this life, the Christian will face trials and tribulations. We will endure hardship. We will enter the kingdom of God, yes, but through much suffering. The Christian life is not always easy. The road is often long, filled with temptations, troubles, and doubts. And just like the disciples standing here in the gap between chapters 8 and 9 must have wondered, are we following the right one? Is he really the way? Here in this transfiguration moment, Jesus helps them and he helps us to catch a glimpse of his glory and his greatness. For here he pulls back the veil. He gives the church then and today a taste of what is to come. And in doing so, he strengthens our faith, showing us that the way of the kingdom, though it is hard and though it is often unexpected, it is one that is filled with unimaginable hope. And friends, for those who recognize this, for those who recognize Jesus as Peter did as the Christ, and for those who deny themselves, die to self, and follow him, and for those who listen to the Son, they will experience life forever in his presence. They will dwell on another mountain, because God himself will come to tabernacle with his people. For this is what we heard a number of weeks ago, Revelation 21. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Christian, that is your future because Christ the King has secured that future for you. So be encouraged. Take up your cross and follow him. Let me pray. Eternal God and ever-wise Father, you are one who dwell in unapproachable light. And yet we come before you this evening with trembling hearts and grateful wonder. Lord, as we in a sense have climbed this mountain, we see not a mere man, not a lawgiver, not a prophet, but your Holy One, the exact imprint of your nature. And we thank you that Christ did not stay upon a mountain, but he came down to the valley, down to suffering, down to the cross, and down into the grave. And, O Christ, we thank you that you are the greater Moses, one who does not just bring us out of bondage, but one who calls for us to dwell with you forever. O Christ, you are the greater Elijah, one who does not just call fire down from heaven, but takes the fire of wrath upon himself so that we might be spared. Spirit of the living God, help us to listen to the Son. Help us to fix our eyes and hearts on the one who makes the presence of the Father a home and not a horror. We long for the day when the mountaintop experience will not be a momentary thing, but our eternal reality. And until that day, keep us faithful, keep us near, keep us listening to the Son. In Christ's name we ask. Amen.